China's infection policy. Insanity? Hello and welcome back to N.D.P. News. And if you're a new subscriber, we're glad to have you here. If you're a returning one, we're equally excited that you're joining us. Thanks for tuning in. Now, let's dive into today's topic. In December of last year, tragedy struck Guan Yao's family in Beijing as he lost 5 members of his family, including his father, father-in-law, and grandmother. Despite being thousands of miles away in California, Guan's grief was palpable, and his words were carefully chosen, reflecting a cautiousness that is all too familiar to those who hail from China. His grief was compounded by the knowledge that the circumstances surrounding the deaths of his loved ones were shrouded in mystery and obfuscation. For those familiar with the ways of the Chinese government, Guan's reluctance to implicate the government directly was no surprise. The Chinese government is notorious for its tight control over the flow of information and the narrative surrounding events. The rules that govern the issuance of death certificates are among the most opaque and are closely guarded secrets. Doctors are required to assign causes of death that conform to the government's preferred narrative, regardless of the actual circumstances surrounding the death. While it is possible that Guan's family members were indeed infected with COVID, the government's insistence that the deaths were caused by other factors is symptomatic of a larger pattern of obfuscation and misinformation that has characterized the Chinese government's response to the pandemic from the outset. The official Chinese government documents tell a different story from the reality that was playing out in the streets and hospitals of China's cities and towns. As the pandemic swept across China, leaving piles of corpses in its wake, the Chinese government doubled down on its efforts to control the narrative and downplay the scale of the crisis. For almost 2 weeks, the government persisted in its claim that no one in China had officially died of COVID, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This concerted effort to massage the numbers and present a false front to the world is par for the course in China, where the government is more concerned with projecting an image of strength and competence than with telling the truth. Supporters of the Chinese Communist Party are well versed in the art of walking a careful line, careful not to stray too far from the official narrative while still acknowledging the reality of the situation. As one undisclosed Chinese businessman put it, the government's numbers are not necessarily accurate, but you have to look at the positive side. They did it for us. This willingness to overlook the government's shortcomings and to focus instead on the perceived benefits of the government's actions is indicative of the complex relationship that many Chinese citizens have with their government. Despite the government's best efforts to control the narrative, there are those who remain unconvinced. However, the Chinese government has an array of tools at its disposal to maintain its grip on power, including a vast network of police and propaganda officers who are adept at making people believe the government's version of events. As one secret policeman once said, "You don't believe it, but what are you gonna do about it?" This pervasive sense of resignation and helplessness is all too common among Chinese citizens, who feel powerless in the face of a government that is determined to control every aspect of their lives. Inside China, the government-controlled media and covert propaganda officers are working overtime to reinforce the government's narrative and to sing the praises of the pandemic prevention policies. Please take a second to like the video as we move on. The pandemic as a tool for control. China's draconian measures. The discourse surrounding China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been marked by a polarization of views, with Western observers and Chinese experts offering diametrically opposed perspectives on the matter. While some Western commentators have been quick to praise the Chinese government's measures for their supposed efficacy in curbing the spread of the virus, others have voiced their skepticism about the underlying motives and consequences of these policies. On the one hand, there are those who argue that while some of Xi's measures may seem extreme, the results speak for themselves. The transmission and death rates in China have been lower than those in many other countries, thanks in no small part to the swift and decisive action taken by the Chinese authorities. Such observers view Xi's policies as correct, scientific, and effective, and believe that they have been instrumental in reducing the impact of the pandemic on the Chinese people. On the other hand, there are experts who vehemently disagree with this assessment, arguing that Xi's measures have little to do with public health and everything to do with consolidating his power and control over Chinese society. According to these critics, Xi's policies are a masterclass in dictatorship, designed to show the Chinese people that the government is in charge and that dissent will not be tolerated. They argue that totalitarian pandemic prevention policies have been used as a means of wreaking havoc on the lives of millions of Chinese citizens, with little regard for their health, safety, or well-being. Such policies are seen as a humanitarian catastrophe that is both anti-scientific and deeply damaging to the Chinese people. Indeed, the implementation of Xi's policies has been marked by a systematic erosion of civil liberties and human rights in China. Before December 7, 2022, the Chinese government pushed a zero-COVID policy, which effectively amounted to a mass imprisonment campaign. As the pandemic continued to spread, Xi expanded this policy to cover the entire country, resulting in draconian measures that severely restricted the movement and freedoms of the Chinese people. In many places, just one positive case of COVID-19 was enough to trigger a complete lockdown of an entire district or city. Transportation links were severed, shops were closed, and residents were confined to their homes, with no right to leave even for basic necessities like food or medical attention. These measures were justified as necessary to protect public health, but in reality, they were a thinly veiled attempt to accumulate more power and control for Xi and his government. Under these policies, the Chinese government has been given unprecedented powers to invade people's privacy and restrict their movements. No warrants are needed to storm into people's residences, and thousands of people can be forced into isolation at any time. Those who resist are subjected to brutal punishments, with police and government officials often using excessive force to subdue their victims. Families have been dragged into the maelstrom, with punishments that can affect 3 generations of a family. Pandemic policy failures in China, countless deaths and tragedies. China's pandemic prevention policies have been heavily criticized for their role in countless deaths and tragedies. The toll has been devastating, with elderly citizens taking their own lives due to lack of medical treatment, young people resorting to suicide because they cannot make a living, and unborn babies dying in the womb while their mothers awaited treatment. Moreover, China's pandemic prevention policy of turning residential zones into prisons has also had disastrous consequences, preventing fire engines from gaining access to buildings in times of emergencies. The devastating fire that broke out in the far western city of Urumqi on November 24, 2022, is a stark example of this, resulting in the deaths of 10 individuals and injuring many more. In a surprising turn of events, the Chinese government made an unexpected 180-degree turn 2 weeks later on December 7th, ending citywide lockdowns and forced PCR testing. The sudden change in policy left the public bewildered and vulnerable to the spread of the virus. In the following days, the death toll rose exponentially, including among respected scholars, journalists, film directors, celebrities, high-level communist officials, and military officers. Even in wealthy cities such as Shanghai, there was a severe shortage of basic fever medications and painkillers. Hospitals were overcrowded, with doctors and nurses risking their lives while filling out death certificates amid the wailing and moaning of patients. The impact of the pandemic on Guan Yao's family is a testament to the overwhelming scale of the crisis. His father's cremation cost his family 30,000 won, and his grandmother had to wait 10 days for cremation due to the overwhelming number of bodies. Hospital and mortuary freezers were filled to capacity, with some cities resorting to using seafood and meat storage freezers to store corpses. The situation in remote townships and hamlets is even more dire, where rural villages are experiencing widespread infections without access to medicine. Impoverished farmers resort to herbal remedies, with some having never heard of the coronavirus or the Omicron subvariant. The situation is so dire that some believe that a broth made with pears can suppress coughing, while others shake leaves and flowers off loquat trees in the belief that they will save their lives. Despite the overwhelming tide of death and suffering, Xi's government has shown no willingness to acknowledge any mistakes or shortcomings. In fact, party officials hold grand celebrations and publish volumes of self-congratulatory articles, demonstrating the power of propaganda in an autocratic society where the truth is what you say it is. Xi's recent break with convention in getting his wish for a third term and the likelihood of him becoming emperor for life has led to concerns about the future of China and the wider world. Over the past decade, Xi has demonstrated his ability to inflict suffering, with the past 3 years of COVID serving as a stark example. As the Chinese government enters a new round of negotiations with Pfizer, many believe that their refusal to import efficacious Western coronavirus vaccines and treatments while pushing domestic vaccines and promoting herbal concoctions is an indication that they do not value human life as much as they claim. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to check out our other videos on the channel for more great content. And please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. This has been N.D.P News, and we'll catch you in the next one.